Hello, everybody. This is Matthias Duwe, head of the climate team at Ecologic Institute, joined by Benjamin Görlach, head of economics and the policy assessment at Ecologic Institute. And we are bringing to you today a webinar for ELEEP, the Emerging Leaders in Environment and Energy Policy Network, a project that we run together with our dear colleagues in DC of the Atlantic Council and the Ecologic Institute US. Our topic today is transatlantic competition under the Paris Agreement. We want to give some insight on the concept of carbon leakage and the times when the US president has withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement, citing concerns over the economic impacts and at times at which this is definitely also a live concern in the conversations in the European Union. I'm very grateful, Benjamin, that you were able to join us. Benjamin has been working on issues relating to economic assessments, in particular carbon pricing and their impacts on design for many a year now, not just at the Ecologic Institute. And he's currently conducting a project that is looking into carbon leakage, the concept, and some of its real-world implications. And so he's going to share some of that work with us today. Over to you.
Thank you. All right. So thanks a lot, Matthias, for the opportunity. And hello, everybody out there. So perhaps one thing to note first is to start with what do we mean when we talk about carbon leakage? And it's, I think, fair to say that, first of all, this is actually not a new debate at all, but it's a debate that has been going on for quite some time. It can be traced back intellectually, if you want, to debate starting in the 1990s about is there a race to the, how does environmental regulation affect competitiveness? Is there a possibility of a race to the bottom where countries would lower their environmental standards to attract business, or where there would be a risk that there could be a pollution havens forming where countries sort of attract business by having lower regulations? So that debate started in the 1990s. There were other views also put forward. The famous Porter hypothesis by Porter and von der Linde, that quite to the contrary, actually, it could be a competitive edge for countries to improve regulation, because by regulating businesses, they might induce them to work more efficiently and thereby cut costs, and ultimately also the idea of perhaps having a first mover advantage, so to be the first in entering into new markets. So the intellectual tradition goes back quite a while. Since we've had carbon pricing in different parts of the world, the debate has sort of now taken this form of the discussion of carbon leakage. Certainly in Europe, it's a debate we've been having for quite some time. So I want to take a look at, first of all, what are the forms and channels of carbon leakage, and then discuss why is it a problem, or is it a problem, and why is it a problem? Then look a bit at what sectors are exposed, and then turn towards what are sort of going forward, what are the new trends in this old debate, or this debate that's been going on for a while.
Excellent. That sounds like sort of a good outline. And, for anyone who's participating live, like Alexander, we'll give you the opportunity to come in after between specific sections to come with comments or ask some questions. And we'll also sort of pick up whatever people write in the live chat. So first, yes, what are we talking about? What's this carbon leakage thing that everybody was going on about?
So as a proper scientist, I try to, of course, start with definitions, which are sort of quite dry and boring, if you want. Yeah. And which you can read from the screen here. But in a nutshell, the basic idea is that you have a situation where different jurisdictions apply different climate policies, or climate policies of different intensity and rigor. And that leads to a relocation of greenhouse gas emitting activities to the other jurisdiction, which has the lower carbon or the less ambitious carbon policy. So that, in a nutshell, is what it sort of comes down to. Talk about what is carbon leakage. Then the question is, through what does it actually look like in practice? Through which forms and channels does carbon leakage happen? Yes. So just to give one example of what it could look like in a very simplified type of understanding, but something that you're ready to observe in practice. That is a picture from Der Spiegel, from a German newspaper, about a steel mill in the last of its kind in Dortmund, and a very gigantic one, which actually in 2002 was stripped by a group of 1,000 Chinese workers that came to Dortmund to take down this factory, to put it into ships and to ship it to China and to build it up there again. So if you want, that's kind of the most concrete type of carbon leakage you'll find. But the thing is, you'll find very few of these examples. So the physical relocation of assets usually just doesn't make economic sense. And B, actually, as you see, this happened in 2002. So it was 3 years before the European emissions trading scheme started. So it could be driven by many things, but most probably not by climate policy differences. And indeed, as we said, one of the defining things for carbon leakage is it should be driven by differences in climate policy. So that is not the one. Then what do we see, or what could be ways of conceiving of carbon leakage? So there are three different interpretations that have been, or different conceptualizations of carbon leakage that have been put forward. The first is operational leakage, which does apply to this idea that production is relocated from existing capacities. As I said, the first example, that you physically relocate a plant from one country to another, is very, very rare in real life. The second one is more likely to happen, or the second and third one, which is that within one company, you might have the installations located in different countries, and they might choose to produce more in those locations where where there's less of a carbon constraint applying to their production, so where basically emitting is cheaper. But the same thing could also happen between companies. So that could be this typical example of a sort of a US-based steel company losing market shares to a Chinese competitor, because the Chinese competitor can sort of expand its production based on the existing capacities.
But this could very well also have to do with a whole range of other drivers, right? So, it could be a factor of demand for that product shifting in terms of geography.
Yeah, and that is exactly also one of the problems of how to find carbon leakage, that you don't have this laboratory situation where you can just switch off all other influences and then just add climate policy and keep everything else constant. And then see what happens if you just only have climate policy and everything else doesn't change. So as you're completely right that there could be any number of factors, from energy prices to wage levels to being close to production to being close to serving local demand, etc. And these factors do, of course, have a huge influence on what is produced where. And climate policies, or differences in climate policies, are one of the factors possibly contributing, but whether they're actually among the most important ones is sort of empirically very contested, and we'll get to that, what the evidence tells us. But so while we're still on sort of on the theoretical side, that's what it could look like. The second big channel would be investment leakage. So not looking at existing capacities, but looking at the question, where do companies choose to invest and choose to expand their operations, and do they go into locations that have a weaker carbon constraint, that have less ambitious climate policies? Again, in practice, difficult to disentangle, because their two investment decisions would have a number of factors that flow into them. You don't usually have the luxury of being able to study exactly how the investment decision was made. I mean, it is a trading off of different risks, and is at the heart of entrepreneurial activity to make that decision. And it will consider the cost of carbon and regulation and expectation, but it will also consider many other things. And
there's a literal metaphor of the closed boardroom involved, right? So,
indeed,
which is where the business decisions are being taken.
Yeah. So that's sort of empirically indeed also one important question. How do you actually find out what role the carbon constraint had in that decision-making process, which is tricky indeed. So in one of the piece of work we're doing is to look at, can we find a smoking gun where there is an installation where it was crystal clear that due to differences in carbon constraint, that investment has gone to region A and not to region B. And we're still looking. We have candidates identified, but we haven't really found the smoking gun, the smoke from the gun, if you want. And then just to wrap up there is one third category that would be leakage happening through resource markets. And what is meant by that is that if you consider there is a given supply of oil and gas, and if then country A chooses to reduce its consumption of these fossil resources, what that does, if the supply remains the same, it will drive down the prices, and somebody else will have an incentive to burn more of the stuff. And so that's leakage driven by prices through resource markets. And it's, if you want, it's sort of a different beast, a different channel, and one that is particularly difficult to address when we come to the sort of later talk about different options. That's one where basically the only real solution is a global agreement on limiting either fossil fuel consumption or limiting emissions, but where individual countries have less capacities to influence that. We'll gloss over the last one. There could also be incidents of leakage happening within one country if you cover certain sectors, but not other ones. If you cover, for instance, rail transport, but not aviation, you might have effects of leakage between these sectors, but that's generally sort of a lesser concern for this debate.
Thank you. Let me just check whether we have a question sort of from the chat, and if not, we'll move on. So no immediate sort of comment or responses, and everybody who is on live, sort of feel free to come in at any time. So, that was, I think, also already a useful overview. Thank you, Benjamin, for sort of, unpacking the issue a little bit and sort of clarifying, the different strands, sort of the actual operational leakage and the investment leakage in particular. I think useful to keep apart. But you started hinting at, sort of your own attempts at sort of finding specific incidences of this happening. So, the next question is really, sort of, is it a problem? How is it a problem? How big a problem is it? Sort of, what do we know about that?
Yeah. And indeed, we're in the lucky situation that several scholars have studied that, and we're just one among a big bunch of institutions that have looked into that. And there's broadly two categories of approaches to studying that question, and one is ex-ante studies that are typically model-based, where you just add a carbon price and then run a CGE model or another type of model that will then tell you how is that going to affect global trade and how is it going to affect sort of shifting of economic activity of production and investment and deployment. And those studies, generally speaking, do find evidence of a leakage risk. However, this other part of the truth is that wherever there's been empirical ex post attempts to really identify, where has leakage actually really happened, is it observable, that they have found little or no conclusive evidence of carbon leakage actually happening. There's different reasons why that may be so difficult to observe. One is that in general, in pretty much all the schemes that have applied, or the systems that have applied carbon pricing, we've had very low carbon prices in recent years. So we rarely had examples where carbon prices anywhere in the world, sort of in emissions trading schemes, went above, say, 20 euro a ton. And so at the current price levels that we're seeing, it's not likely that that's going to have much effect. The second important consideration is that all the carbon pricing systems that exist in the world today have provisions built into them, especially to limit carbon leakage. And so the fact that we don't find ex post carbon leakage happening could also just be proof that these provisions are working and achieving the objective.
So that essentially means that we presently have no means of verifying whether it's either one or the other. So the models are basically suggesting it should be an issue and there should be some of it happening, but then the real world hasn't actually sort of made us enter into a situation where this prices are such that it would enter into effect in some sorts, and then sort of we still have the safeguards that if that were to happen, that would prevent it from happening.
Exactly. So kind of there's different levels that you will need to get across before you would see that happening in reality. I mean, I think it also goes to the fact that we have, when I say there's little or no evidence of leakage happening, usually these studies have looked at operational leakage. Investment leakage, there is less evidence, but then there too, it's sort of something that is more difficult to
there's the boardroom again.
Exactly, there's the boardroom again. You could think, hey, there's investment statistics and there's trade statistics, and don't we see anything happening there? I think there the trouble is that it all just becomes jumbled up in the baseline. So the starting point is that we have we don't have sort of a stable situation where nothing else changes, but we do have a system where we've seen rapid growth in heavy industries in some parts of the world, and also degrowth happening in other parts of the world, driven by a number of factors. Mostly just the fact that emerging economies had such a huge demand for things like steel and concrete when building up the infrastructure, etc. And so there was this ongoing trend going on for a number of decades anyway, of particularly heavy industries expanding much more rapidly in emerging economies than in the OECD countries or in the Europe and and North America. And when there's so much going on in the baseline already, it's sort of much more difficult to disentangle what is the delta, what's the contribution of carbon leakage. And that's of course where, then again, models will help you because they have the luxury of assuming away all the other trends and influences. But and when you sort of look at the trends empirically, you don't have that luxury necessarily.
And are in there sort of these instances though where individual companies have basically sort of also made public claims about sort of their actions being driven or influenced by carbon prices? So have they not in some cases actually sort of tried to offer a smoking gun to the public? So I do remember the German aluminium plant near Hamburg closing down, for example, kind of citing increased electricity prices, or ThyssenKrupp's, to some extent, I think, sort of ill-fated venture of expanding and investing in Brazil, in particular, expanding their capacity there. But I think actually suffering significant losses sort of in the long run. But companies, certainly in Europe, seem to be bringing up this issue a lot. So do they then not? Does that not hold much water then in your assessment?
Well, let's put it like that. So you do find indeed that companies question the long-term viability of producing in Europe and relate this to carbon pricing and to the question of whether they will continue to receive free allocation. But when you look at sort of individual investment decisions that have actually been taken where money has been invested, there to find a sort of official confirmation of whether carbon pricing has been a contributing factor, we haven't found evidence at that level, despite sort of calling a number of companies and doing a number of research, so going through all their annual reports, etc. We did find a few cases where companies sort of, when doing big investment decisions within Europe, stating that no, carbon pricing has not been a major factor in that decision, but that rather, as also sort of was evidenced by the literature, that rather things like being close to skilled labor supply, being close to resources, etc., being close to infrastructure, having reliable electricity supply, all these things, that was much more influential in for the decision.
So nevertheless, those are instances of some of the stuff that we're seeing, that may then be part of the politics, right? And so I have the advantage of knowing what your next slide looks like, and so I know that this is a topic that you also wanted to pick up on. So I'll move this forward and sort of then kindly expand on that. So the political side of it.
Yeah. So I mean, the question is it really a problem? You could say sort of empirically it's undecided and the research is not conclusive. Does it really exist or not? But the truth is, it is of course a problem because it is politically it's sort of made out to be a problem. It's just a line of thought, a sort of mental argument that is extremely sort of has much political power, and this was of course evidenced most recently very much by Donald Trump and his decision to draw out of Paris, that we explicitly motivated by the fact that he sees Paris as a job killer, costing jobs, leading to the decline of industries in the US. And so literally making this claim that, sort of other countries benefit and they can expand their industrial base and the US loses it. So it's sort of clearly exactly the argument of carbon leakage. So as one might expect, he's not too worried about the empirical basis for many of these things. But it's certainly something that sells well and that is sort of intuitively appealing and therefore is taken over.
Yeah, and I mean, as I was indicating,
just to say, this is not something that is limited to the US. No, it's certainly, of course, also a figure of argument that is is convincing in lots of other countries, and that is a concern basically in all countries that have carbon pricing.
Sure, yeah, and it's, we in Europe, sort of in the debate, know how prominently it features, in anything to do with the European emissions trading system and its design, its impact on industry. So. You brought us some additional examples of this, right? So how is the issue then being dealt with if it's politically a problem?
Yeah.
Then you were talking earlier about the ways in which it's actually factored in to policy design as well. And I was just talking about the EU ETS example. So how's this then being measured and incorporated in this policy?
Yeah. So I mean, the first thing is to try and understand what sectors are actually at risk of carbon leakage. So where does this risk apply? And that's what you'll see here. The metric that has pretty much evolved universally, as far as I'm aware, among all countries that address this problem, is to look at a combination of what's the cost burden that a industrial sector will carry because of carbon pricing or because of climate policy, and B, what is their exposure to international competition. And for the latter, the proxy that is usually used is trade intensity. The rationale for that being that there might be sectors that have a high cost burden to carry, but they're not exposed to international competition. The prime example of that is the power sector, where it's included. If you produce power in Europe, you have little to fear from competition outside Europe, simply because the transmission capacity isn't there. So that will only be a problem in certain sort of, border regions, perhaps to Ukraine, but generally speaking, it's not a concern. So basically, you're physically protected from competition from outside the jurisdicted sector. Therefore, the cost burden isn't as much of a problem, and importantly, companies will be able to pass on the cost burden to the consumer, so they will be able to increase their prices. And that is presumed to be different for companies that have a high exposure to international competition. So basically, that applies to sort of trade intensity being the proxy, the shorthand here, which is taken to mean that if there's a high trade intensity, that means it is possible and feasible to ship the sector across countries, and therefore that means that the companies will not be in a position to pass on the cost from regulation.
Right. So if I'm able to order it cheaper, sort of in the US or China, then exactly. As a consumer in Europe, then that product is essentially under threat.
Exactly. And of course, transport costs again sort of offer some kind of protection. So it's a question of really what's the relation between transport costs and the value of the product. So if you're in the cement business, for instance, it might well be that if you operate in southern Bavaria or in Austria, where you're far away from the next seaport, you have that basically is a physical protection from China or from Egypt or from sort of some other cement manufacturer from outside the EU. Whereas if you operate on the coast of Italy, right next to a harbor, it might well be that you are actually threatened by carbon leakage. And so trade intensity captures this element of international competition. And basically, the sectors we should be worried about, or where the whole leakage risk is most conceivable, is those where you have the combination of both high trade intensity and a high cost burden from the carbon price. And there you look at basically universally, it's pretty much always the same sectors you're looking at. So it's metals, it's the chemical industry, it's refineries. Fertilizer, pulp and paper, those types of sectors.
We do have a question sort of from our chat window, which is sort of linked to the overall question of how big a problem it is, and so the evidence, and sort of maybe it doesn't fit perfectly in here, but I'd suggest that we pick it up. At this point in time, which I think may fit well into actually looking beyond, sort of the current work and looking into what options are for, sort of looking at this issue differently. Because, and the question here is basically saying if the evidence for carbon leakage, sort of is weak under current carbon pricing designs, and sort of partially this is, sort of this is also down to the impact that the carbon pricing signal can actually have, then to what extent does that also say something about the effectiveness of carbon pricing in its current form, and actually really impacting investment decisions and sort of going into lower carbon options, because in the end, that's what it's meant to be doing.
No, that is a good question, and I would say indeed that the two are linked to some extent. We've seen carbon prices that, if you think of the EU ETS carbon price at, I think it's now €6.50 or something, but sort of it's been hovering between closer to €5 than to €10 for the last 2 years now. And that's just not a price level that is going to drive much change. It's also not a price level that's going to have much influence on investment decisions. So in that sense, I would say, yes, indeed, the two are combined. And if we were to get to transformational carbon prices, so like if you, and that differs very much sort of by which sector you look at and what technology you want to look at, but if you think that sort of what carbon price would be needed to really drive change in investments in fuel switching and these kinds of things, you're looking certainly sort of north of 40, 50, 60 euro in those categories. And then you'd be much more worried about carbon leakage. There would be much more reason for concern about that. And so that's indeed also one of the questions. If we were to say, so let's have a carbon price that is capable of driving change, for instance, in the power sector, that's one area where you can sort of quantify it relatively well and sort of estimate what you would need to really drive the switch from coal and lignite to gas as a cleaner fossil fuel. Would the industry even be capable of sort of stomaching that kind of carbon price? So that's one argument why it might be tricky in the longer run to have these sort of high carbon prices. You certainly need much more leakage protection in that case. And if it wasn't a problem now, it might well become a problem then.
So, now the reality of, current carbon prices are one element of consideration that you indicated could potentially be subject to change. The other is, of course, the whole international policy setup. And while, on the one hand, President Trump cited concerns of the economic impacts as a rationale for pulling out of the Paris Agreement, I think one can make an argument that also the Paris Agreement puts the world on a much more equal footing when it comes to sort of climate policy, right? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And that's actually one area that is interesting to look at. I mean, it's somewhat astonishing if you look at the sort of the policy debate that we have in the EU. You still find that often enough it's still based on this premise that the EU has a very, very ambitious climate policy, and nobody else in the rest is in the world is doing anything.
We are the only ones.
We're the only ones doing anything.
Of course, exactly. Everybody knows that.
And that was, of course, not true for a while, and it's certainly not true in the post-Paris world. And that means that also this question of what are the actual differences in climate policy that needs to be reevaluated to some extent. And this is actually also one piece of work that we're looking at into. So to begin with, when you do this assessment of what is the extra carbon leakage risk, it's not necessary to look at all countries in the world, because we don't trade with all countries in the world in the same degree. Basically, from the German perspective, we start looking at, you find that in those sectors that we're talking about, so steel and cement and pulp and paper and a few others, first of all, the bulk of trade is inner-European to begin with. So between 60 and 80% of Germany's trade happens within the European Union. And that basically is not, is immune to carbon leakage, because every pulp and paper producer in the EU faces the same conditions under the EU. It faces the same carbon price, same allocation, same everything pretty much. Mm-hmm. So that basically the sort of more difficult candidate then is the US, where the picture is very differentiated. You have parts of the US where a carbon price does apply. So California, for instance, has a similar system to what's operating in the US.
The EU.
In the EU.
In fact, they've gone sort of even, beyond what the EU is covering with their carbon pricing, right?
They do cover as well also transport and housing, the housing sector. However, because those are not competing with EU producers, kind of, but they do, importantly, they do cover industry emissions, which are the sort of the leakage candidates here.
It's also a little unfair to be saying that housing in San Francisco would be on in competition with I don't know living on the outskirts of Paris, for example.
Exactly. Well, but then the downside is that California accounts for 4% of the US-EU trading volume. So basically, it's not nothing, but it's not a game changer either. And as for the rest of the US, well, let's see what the future really brings. I mean, for now, that's sort of one of the interesting questions. How do you compare different types of policies and the effect they have? If you just look at carbon pricing, then obviously you would say, well, US doesn't have it except for California. There is another system in the northeastern US, but that applies to electricity production only, so it's not relevant for the for the leakage debate and to that extent. But you do have, of course, air quality regulations, energy efficiency standards, all types of other regulations applying to industry. So it's not like you have a completely free and open context to invest in the US and sort of just build the most polluting factory you would want to. So you do get to into a much more complex comparison of what's kind of the level of ambition embodied in these other types of regulations, which is arguably more difficult to compare than just comparing carbon prices.
Right. But it sort of also does go to show that even if you're not comparing carbon constraint related policies like that, you know, there are other regulatory actions that could actually create similar impacts in terms of the constraints under which industrial installations need to operate.
And there is one important dimension to this, related again to the Paris Agreement, which is that basically, if you want to put it bluntly, we don't live in a world anymore where any country is happy to accept any type of foreign investment in any type of dirty sector, and not worry about the emissions that brings with it. So basically, we've now come into a system where all countries, well, the US chose to ignore theirs, but all countries have entered into commitments. They come in very different shapes and sizes. They have very different level of ambitions. But in any country, there's going to be some kind of target related to how they want to see their country developing towards some kind of low carbon pathway.
Right.
And so nobody has a free ride anymore in the sense of that they can just sort of attract dirty industries and whatever. And you certainly have the question in coming up in places like China, sort of what do they see as their economic future, and what role is there also for these heavy industries in there? You know, do they want to continue to be the world's leading cement, steel, whatever producer, or do they see their fortune in other sectors? So that goes into this direction of, you know, what kind of structural change do we see going forward?
Yeah. So you mean basically, do they want to stay the manufacturing house of the world, but at potentially the expense of the health of their sort of citizens that live in the vicinity of these places? Right. What I think would still be interesting to see sort of whether there are other ways that we should, sort of think about the issue differently. And one of the things that strikes me in this regard, and I know that you've also been thinking about this, and we've had previous conversations, is, is there maybe a different way, taking that China example and changing our perspective, is there maybe a different way that we should think about policy that could tackle the fear of carbon leakage? So is there a progressive alternative that, is looking at this from an innovation perspective, maybe picking up on the very beginning of your introduction to the topic? Is it sort of about the pollution haven, or is there, this race to the top opportunity also? And what would potential policy responses look like that turn this argument on its head?
So first to say that the carbon leakage is, of course, in some ways a defensive debate. It's about protecting the industries that are already there, that do have an important economic role, that do employ people, etc. So it's not to maintain that these industries would somehow suddenly become completely irrelevant. But it is about sort of protecting these industries already there. And the interesting question that we now face is, how do you encourage these industries to make the transition? How do you support them in making the transition so that they can find their role in what's going to be a low carbon economy going forward? So how do you get to these sort of breakthrough innovations, low carbon products that would eventually decide tomorrow's competitiveness? It might well be that it's not the cheapest producer of steel, but the one company that finds the way to sort of manufacture steel and cement in a novel way that involves much less carbon pollution, or to come up with construction materials that can absorb CO2, for instance, and then sort of integrate it into the product. I think it's also one thing that's sometimes overlooked to some extent is that we will just be needing much. I mean, if we are to arrive in a low carbon economy, if we want to be successful in getting there, one of the preconditions is that we just would have to be using much less resources overall. So the total volume of resource use will be lower, will have to be lower. So we need to drastically increase resource efficiency. We just basically have to use, less tons of material to deliver the same services. And that also means that sort of if the business model of steel production is just producing as much steel, as much tons of steel or cement or whatever else it is, that business model is not going to be sustainable anymore, but it's more the question of, so what's going to be the company that starts building bridges from carbon fibers at 1/10 of the weight, but the same stability and the same sort of long-term endurance, etc. So those are the kind of innovations we want to see. And I think it's sort of, that's something where also the European way of looking at that has come around to some extent, saying it's not, we can't price companies into this future. It's the potential of driving innovation through a price is quite limited. There needs to be lots of other things coming together, and one is really supporting innovation, supporting setting up programs that can lead to innovation, but not only sort of the innovation as in sort of the lab and the experiment, but also bringing these things to market maturity, so helping them to sort of push and develop into the market.
So like a carbon pricing plus approach, essentially.
Indeed, yeah. And of course, one of the interesting questions there that also now Europe is looking at is one of the nice properties of carbon pricing is that it also generates some revenue, and that revenue, of course, then can contribute to supporting these types of activities.
And sort of, you think in principle that's also a strategy that's actually quite amenable to a way of doing business in the US, which has actually poured billions into innovation, certainly as part of the structural sort of support programs that were put in place at the end of 2008 and early 2009 as a response to the economic crisis.
Yeah. I mean, that's of course why it's so puzzling to somehow listen to Trump and his arguments, and then as if basically his philosophy, his idea was to walk back to a status quo in the 1950s or 1960s, and sort of if that's the idea of competitiveness, to walk back to this mythical stage in the past, then that's hardly a forward-looking positive view of a competitive industry.
Yeah, so I think interestingly, sort of what we're seeing in the States is that there's really, there are conversations happening sort of at different ends of the spectrum. I think sort of both that innovation conversation and also the very defensive approach that are both taking place in parallel. And sort of one of the interesting questions is, sort of, is there a space where they can meet? Yeah. And I'd like sort of to take that as something that leads in maybe sort of a last small topic to touch upon, which is related to potential ways how this could develop, especially in a transatlantic relationship where, the rhetoric of the current US administration on trade issues in particular has been sort of more, a little potentially more aggressive and protective, sort of defensive of its own interest. And at the same time, this did trigger some similar responses in Europe, where sort of the industrial players concerned are also worried about this. How do you see that playing out? Are we looking at a carbon-related trade war of sorts? What are the options there?
It's not going to be triggered by carbon leakage concerns, but if there is a trade war unfolding anyway, then carbon leakage and difference in carbon price could well play a role there. So to say that basically, if you look at what countries have done so far to tackle carbon leakage, it's pretty much universally the rule was just to give free allocation to the producers at risk. Basically, tell them, okay, you need to pay a carbon price. We're going to basically subsidize you by giving you free allowances, and that way you don't have to worry about any cost burden. I mean, companies have been okay with this system. Basically, I mean, it's not also in their interest to see a trade war starting, and it's quite in their interest to get allowances for free. And so that's generally sort of worked fine for businesses. There was always the demand that to really get to the bottom of it, several scholars have suggested that over the years that what we should really be aiming for is some kind of border adjustment measure, where you say, well, if you trade between one country that has a carbon price and one country that doesn't have a carbon price, basically the non-pricing one, if they import stuff to the priced one, they would have to pay a tariff at the border to make up for this difference. That's something that is is being applied in other regimes. In VAT, for instance, it does happen. There is always a question whether that would be compatible with WTO rules, where we haven't really, we haven't seen it because it's never been applied, so it's never been brought before the WTO, but there is at least reasons to assume that you could design it in such a way that it would be WTO compatible. But the truth is it never really happened, mostly because nobody wanted to risk the resulting fallout. So nobody wanted to upset the trading partners by starting what would be seen as a trade war or aggressive behavior. I think the closest thing we've come to that was when the EU decided to include international aviation in the EU emission trading scheme.
I remember that.
Indeed. And that didn't go too well for the European Union. It wasn't a border tax adjustment as such. What it was including foreign producers into the scheme, but it had similar effects. And that led to a big political rollback, basically. I think legally it wasn't, that wasn't so much the issue. WTO compatibility, we never come to that point. So it was not so much a legal issue, but much more political issue. But the EU wasn't sort of successful on that account. And that's why I would have said normally these border adjustments, well-founded theoretically as they may be, but we're unlikely to see them because there's simply no appetite for that. But if we do find ourselves in a world now where the US starts playing around with tariffs, particularly also for those sectors we're talking about, for steel and other sectors, it might well be that we do see, that Europeans think differently about that. And in that case, then differences in carbon pricing would, of course, be one possibly also legitimate way to look at that. It will be wonderfully complicated, though, if you start thinking about if we were to apply this not between the EU and the US, but also to other trading partners, then you would be exactly in that game of having to judge then what's the ambition level of what is a ton of cement produced in China? How is that? What cost burden does that carry compared to the ton of cement produced in the Netherlands or in Portugal? That's
right, and it would probably have to be differentiated by sort of what factory was it that was producing this potentially, right? It could be coming out of a super modern, clean Chinese facility. Indeed. That's actually sort of better on average in terms of carbon intensity of the product than your average European mill.
Indeed, those are the questions, the types of questions you would have to grapple with, or how do you deal with the fact that sort of the carbon price for this lot of steel, that shipload of steel arriving was €6.50, but then for the next shipload arriving might have been €8 or something like that. So you sort of technically it's going to be interesting to solve that out.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Benjamin. And I think sort of on that topic, I think we can assume that while there are going to be proponents of both sides of sort of a little bit of a tougher order of business, that also there are moderating forces that will sort of try to prevent political row over these issues. But I think overall it's also clear that in the current circumstances and with so many factors at play, we're going to be monitoring the situation closely, because this is a topic that we could well be coming back to in terms of it actually being a hot issue between the EU and the US in particular over the next couple of years.
Yeah,
at this point in time, I think we've covered the topic in sort of good level of detail and a useful breadth, unpacking the general topic and the different concepts, going into some of the empirical evidence and the political dimensions. Thank you very much again for making the time and giving us your insights. And thank you everybody for joining us and for watching live or sharing the recording and enjoying this conversation later on. We will be back with further ELEEP webinars in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye.